This was a video that a group I was working with in Copenhagen put together at the request of the Danish government and the hosts of the UN talks to set the expectations for everyone arriving there, what was to come. And then this one, let's see how it goes. This one's really about showing civil society all over the world has been working on this issue in the run-up to Copenhagen. So it gives you a sense of the expectations. A very, very high expectations going into Copenhagen. So what happened? Well, negotiators themselves that were there negotiating the ins and outs of the climate treaty weren't able to come to an agreement. So when the heads of state got there towards the end of the 2-week period of the negotiations, they decided they weren't going to allow for a failure to happen, and they decided we're going to negotiate something that's much shorter, but has the key provisions of an agreement. And what those 4 accomplishments were setting a temperature target for a global limit to temperature, recognizing that the science was saying a maximum of 2 degrees would be safe for humans. And it also allowed in 2015 to review that and see if it should be lowered to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which actually is far more likely is the maximum safe temperature, and that's above pre-industrial levels. Second, developed countries agreed to a bunch of financing, $30 billion over 3 years, 2010 to 2012, building up to $100 billion by 2020 for the developed countries to send to developing countries to help them adopt clean technologies and help them prepare for the impacts of climate change. Also, there was a lot of concern about countries saying they were doing one thing, but not being held to it. And so having transparency in what was called monitoring, reporting, and verification, to be able to have third parties verify that governments are doing what they say they're doing and limiting their emissions. But I think the most important part of it was the heads of state themselves were there. Over 110, 111 heads of state were there. That's the largest number of heads of state for any treaty gathering, much less climate change. And the fact that they were there actually having to save the day and fight with each other for their positions to agree to this Copenhagen Accord, it required them to get very smart on an issue that they normally day-to-day don't have to deal with. And it forced them to actually have a vested interest in something that they were negotiating, and that therefore I believe had more political weight behind it going forward. So I think that was the most important, one of the most important developments there. Since then, that was December of last year, early this year, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, who were the 4 countries negotiating with the United States the initial agreement that came out in Copenhagen. They're 30% of global emissions, and they said they would step up and take action on climate change. And in China's next 5-year plan, China has these 5-year plans. They're very much into planning and living up to those plans for their economies, which includes energy policy, and they're launching a cap-and-trade program in their next 5-year plan. They believe that environmental regulation helps them get rid of their least efficient industries, and that if they put a price on pollution, it will help weed out the laggards in their economies and reward the most efficient companies. Now we've already 110 countries stepped up and made specific commitments under the Copenhagen Accord. Brazil passed a law consistent with their commitment, and more than 20 other developing countries signed on in addition. The commitments that have been made to date don't get us to that 2-degree target that was the limit, but at least brings us down to 3 degrees instead of 4.5 or more. So at least it was a start. The concern also is that if you write off Copenhagen and say it wasn't a legally binding treaty, it was just voluntary statement by governments, that you also write off the real commitments that were made around moving money early. We need to move money as quickly as possible to help developing countries get moving on clean technology and begin to put in place their own policies like China's beginning to do. Since then, in the United States, we had a very hard battle around healthcare legislation, and so a lot of our allies in the Congress had already fought that battle and weren't excited to fight another battle, which climate change was seen to be. And it was really about coming down to legacy industries like oil and coal versus new clean technologies and a cleaner future, the industries of the future in the United States. And I'll talk more about that as I go. Most recently, just last week, were the climate talks in Tianjin, China, and unfortunately, it did look like governments were going back to their corners and walking away from Copenhagen, mostly because the United States didn't pass legislation on climate change, hasn't come forward with any new money, and China's angry and saying, look, we came forward with our voluntary commitment, we put in place a cap and trade for our next 5-year plan, what are you doing? So there's blame to go all around, but the United States certainly has not stepped forward in any way that gives governments, other governments, any faith that the United States is going to do anything truly meaningful on this issue. So we have a challenge ahead of us in the United States. And I just want to touch briefly on what does this mean for business around the world. Given there's no global treaty after 2012 when this one runs out, businesses are really saying, okay, well, at least we're going to do energy efficiency, which is a no-brainer. We're going to invest in making ourselves more efficient. We're taking the long view. We know that climate is going to impact us, and so like Starbucks is looking a lot at its farmers and where it's getting its coffee from and realizing that they're going to have to shift and diversify which farmers they work with based upon the impacts of climate change causing more droughts and floods. So they're looking at this as a risk and an opportunity going forward. Investors are looking at this as more of a long-term issue. Major emitters, so major polluters in the United States, are working with government to try to get these rules in place. They're actually frustrated by the lack of action because they're saying, look, we know we're going to be regulated. We want the rules sooner than later so we can prepare for that. The solution providers like renewable energy companies and efficiency companies are really frustrated, and I'm going to talk about that because they want legislation on climate change and clean energy to help increase the investments they're making in making new jobs in the United States and globally. And then we're finding that companies that are consumer-facing brands like Coca-Cola and eBay and Starbucks, they're getting pressure from customers. Customers are saying, we don't care the government hasn't acted. We want you to act. We want to know what you're doing on environment. What are you doing on sustainability? So they're actually talking to customers about what they're doing, which is scary for them because they don't want to overstate what they're doing, but they are taking steps. And so they're learning how do they talk to customers and also pressure government to take action.